I say some words. I introduce you briefly. That's okay. So, hello everybody. My name is Regina Kreide. I am a professor of political theory at Gießen University in Germany, and it's my great pleasure to open the first panel and to introduce to you the very international guest of today, Fabio Almeida from the University of Brasilia in Brazil. And Fabio has skills and expertise. I will be brief on that, but just that for maybe some of you have met him before, have read of him, but maybe have met him before. So it's my pleasure to say a few words about his skills and expertise. He is specialized in law and legal studies, legal theory, human rights and democracy, modern philosophy and constitutional law. So you are right in between philosophy and law, which is perfect. He wrote his dissertation on the constitutional principles between deontology and axiology, theoretical assumptions towards a democratic hermeneutic theory. That has appeared in English. I wasn't sure about it. Not yet.
Important.
It's coming. It's not yet in English.
My PhD thesis is already in English. It's I can send you all.
Yeah, so if someone is interested in it, that would be possible. There are several articles on the topic of constitutionalism, political liberalism, and democracy. And there's also a very nice website where you can freely download articles, which have been written all in English. And Fabio is now, like I said, at Brazilian University, but spent also a couple of times as a visiting researcher, visiting scholar at Harvard University, Harvard Law School. Yeah. So it's a great pleasure to have you here. And you will talk today on the Darwinian multi-level selection of constitutions. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Regina. First of all, I'd like to thank Professor Gabriel and Professor Hall for organizing this workshop, which I'm sure will be a major step in setting an international network of research in topics such as these concerning the application of evolutionary theory from various strands to the understanding of law and especially constitutionalism. Today I'm here to present my paper, which is a spin-off of my PhD thesis. And here I present, I think, the core of that thesis. Basically, I will follow the very structure of the paper, of 3 sections. And my starting point is the idea that constitutionalism is not to be understood only as a mere product of our history, as understood by the discipline of history, but also from an evolutionary perspective, as taken from the perspective that we are a species that has at least something like 6 million history if we take the standpoint from which we diverted from other apes in the evolutionary point of view. And I think that constitutionalism is a very structure that is part of this whole evolutionary theory, not only from the biological standpoint, but obviously from a cultural and structural perspective. In section 1, I aim to explain the evolution of cooperation based on some recent developments in biological theory, especially concerning the idea of multilevel selection. And the obvious question that comes at first is, okay, why cooperation, why the evolution of cooperation as a starting point? And my view is that there are lots of works being developed in various strands of disciplines such as psychology, economics, sociology, and various other strands. And I think that they have a point, they have something to tell us about the evolution of human society when they base this perspective, the idea of human sociality, on the evolution of cooperation. I think they have something to add to us, and they try to develop an evolutionary theory of constitutionalism based on these insights. And the starting point of these theories is that biological theories of cooperation can tell us a lot about how cooperation can emerge in a natural background. But these theories cannot still, obviously, explain how cooperation emerged within complex societies as those that humans do live in. But they do, these biological theories do have something to tell us about the evolution of cooperation. And for instance, I brought here two mechanisms that biologists have proposed to explain the emergence of cooperation, which are team selection and reciprocal altruism, but they lack the simultaneous perspective to explain how cooperation can emerge in complex societies. They cannot explain, like in bees, how cooperation can emerge in large scale, but when individuals are almost genetic clones from each other, such as bees and ants. Or they can explain how cooperation can emerge in small-scale societies, such as societies where chimpanzees or other apes live in which there is a low rate of genetic relatedness. But they can't, for instance, explain how large societies can emerge out of individuals which are not quite clones of each other. And in order to overcome these limits, a new strand of theory has been developed from both biological and quasi-sociological approach, which is the gene culture coevolutionary theory, which aims to explain the evolution of human society by taking culture into consideration. And basically their idea is that culture, once the human species came to be able to live in an environment where culture is present, culture itself became part of the environment that selects our genetics, and by selecting our genetics, it also selects and calls the evolution of human psychology. So there's a two-way inheritance system in which the evolution of our psychology turns the evolution of culture much more sophisticated, and by being more sophisticated, this novel evolved culture also exerts an impact in the evolution of our social psychology. And as a result, side by side of team selection and reciprocal altruism, these strands of theory bring other mechanisms in order to explain the evolution of human societies, including, in the paper I explain better these mechanisms, but here I will focus on the idea of a universal moral grammar and of group selection, which I think are the two more important mechanisms that this strand of theory brings to us. The idea of the universal moral grammar is based on Noam Chomsky's theory about language acquisition, which basically says that natural selection has selected within our minds specific mechanisms, specific biases to acquire and learn a new language. So within our minds, a small child, and I can tell you by saying that my small child is learning a language like really quickly. In almost 2-3 weeks, he learns lots of new words. So I think that Chomsky has a point there. How can a small child learn a lot of language in 1.5 years or 2 years? And basically, legal scholars such as John Mikhail and psychologists such as Mark Hauser have told and have made some experiments in which they conclude that something similar to these mechanisms of learning language that Chomsky has highlighted also appears to be working in the learning of moral norms and normative behavior. And so, by relying on some psychological and economic experiments, I suggest that at least these dispositions are deeply ingrained in our social psychology. So we can say that humans have an innate tendency to parental care, empathy, a certain sense of justice, a certain sense of cooperating with the members of their community, and being suspicious against outsiders, which I call parochialism, and deeply ingrained egalitarianism. And the other idea is group selection, or the idea that natural selection acts not only to select biological entities, but also to select groups that possess certain cultural values, beliefs, and technologies that make some groups better adapted to the environment and to other groups than others. And in the course of history, some groups are selected and others are not, so it will be part of social evolution. And basically, this idea opens the venue to what has been called as multilevel selection, or the idea that natural selection is acting simultaneously on various levels of social and biological reality, including our genetics, our innate psychology and culture. But note that this is not a bottom-up role. This is a multi-level role in the sense that culture is not more or less important than our social psychology or our genetics. And my idea, my claim, is that this theoretical approach explains the emergence of Pleistocene and hunter-gatherer bands, egalitarian bands, but they still cannot explain the emergence of more complex societies, such as those that emerged in human history in the last 10,000 years or so. Which brings me to another strand of theory in biology, which has been developed by the philosopher of biology, Peter Gottfried Smith, which aims to reject and to refine the idea that Darwinism is based only on three parameters, the class ones, variation, selection, and inheritance. He says that things are much more complicated and that, in fact, biological entities can display much more parameters in biological evolution than only these three variables, that there are almost 9 parameters. But they try to plot these parameters in a more simplified way. But mainly his idea says that there are marginal cases of Darwinism, entities that barely score on these parameters, and much more sophisticated entities that can be projected within this multidimensional chart in order to build paradigmatic cases of Darwinian entities, or entities that fully satisfy all the parameters he proposed. And in order to go from this marginal cases to paradigmatic case of Darwinian entities, biology has produced lots of different kinds of reproducers, from scaffold reproducers like DNA, which needs to be inside other kinds of reproducers in order to reproduce themselves, to collective reproducers such as we are, so in the sense that we are an individual that, but we are composed of many cells, many organs, many other kinds of biological entities which evolve on its own as well. So basically, just to give an example, a slime mold would be a marginal case of Darwinism. A sponge will score high on the inheritance fidelity parameter. Node 3 would score a little better on other parameters, and a cat would be understood as a fluid paradigmatic case of individual Darwinism according to these parameters. This is just an example of how the Peter Gottfried Smith idea would work. And then I make the following provocation. Can we use this multi-dimensional perspective on evolutionary theory to understand the evolution of human societies? And I claim that we can, if we can understand human societies as something like as those those kinds of reproducers that Peter Gottfried Smith says. And I think that the theory of Jonathan Turner gives us some tool to understand how this process might be analogically applied to understand the evolution of society. So Jonathan Turner says that there are 3 layers, 3 levels on which we should analyze sociological ontology, which are microdynamics, or the domain of individual interactions, mesodynamics, or the domain where organizations evolve and interact, and the macrodynamics, where is the level of social systems and social structures as such. And so this brings us to a much more sophisticated account of causation. So it's not a deterministic account. For instance, sociobiologists would would explain social reality by using just one arrow going from genetics to social structure. And I think that the account I'm favoring here is a much more complex picture of how evolution would work in society and cultural evolution, in the sense that we can account even for genetic evolution based on pressure caused by social structures as such. So I think it's a more complex idea. And based on that, I aim to apply Peter Bosworth-Smith's account of evolution in order to understand social evolution. And in this sense, we could say that the smoking groups of our ancestors, or of chimpanzees, for instance, would be marginal case of Darwinian evolution, while the large cooperative groups of hunter-gatherer bands would score better on these parameters, but not so better in order to generate a paradigmatic case of evolution, while the hierarchical tribes of the transition between Pleistocene and Holocene would score even better, but not so far in order to generate a paradigmatic case, which I say are the case of stratified societies and what I have been calling as constitutional societies, which is the object of section 3 of the paper. And this brings us the question, okay, we have so far produced the egalitarian bands, hierarchical tribes, but why did stratification evolve? And based on Parsons, Luhmann, and more recently on the work of Joyce Marcus and Ken Flannery, I argue that stratified societies are much more refined and more capable of coping with social and natural resources than the egalitarian bands of Pleistocene were, and as such, they replaced them in the course of human history. Of course, this is not new, this is based on a sociological approach. And as a result, the first kinds of paradigmatic case of Darwinian entities were produced in our history. But this brings another problem to us. Okay, if these societies are so efficient, why did we become a democratic, egalitarian societies again somehow? Of course, this egalitarianism is much more sophisticated than egalitarianism of egalitarian bands of Pleistocene. But basically, my claim is that constitutionalism is part of the answer for this transition between stratified societies and democratic societies. And basically, this idea comes from the recognition that constitutionalism should be acknowledged as a social adaptation that structures a hierarchical functional differentiation. Of course, this is a claim based on Luhmann's account of the subject, but unlike Luhmann, I think that there is more to be understood in this process than merely the adjustment of social systems. At first, I propose that the object of selection here